It's rather startling and a little puzzling to see John the Baptist, in prison, seeming to have doubts about Jesus. Wait a minute, are you the one who is to come, or should we be looking for someone else? And how does Jesus reply? Well, it goes to explain also why John had those doubts. As we saw last week in the gospel, he's coming out and he's preaching fire. The axe is laid to the root of the tree. His winnowing fork is in his hand. He's going to gather the wheat into the barn, but he's going to burn the chaff with unquenchable fire. And then Jesus comes along and none of that. So he's confused. So how does Jesus answer him? Well, he quotes the first reading today, as I hope you noticed. He says, well, go and tell John about this other scripture that's fulfilled, not the one he was expecting, but this one, where the lame leap for joy, the deaf hear, the blind see, the dead are raised, lepers are cleansed, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. So, he's basically saying, yes, I'm the one who is to come, not what you were expecting, but the one nonetheless. And then he adds, there's a little pinch to John there, and blessed is the one who takes no offense at me. In other words, he's kind of saying to John the Baptist, get over yourself. Don't take any offense at me, even though I'm not what you expected. But this is the kingdom. And then just to make sure the crowds don't misunderstand, he's not putting John down. He goes on to say, so did you go out to see a prophet? Well, indeed, and even more than a prophet, this is the one, the very last one, of whom it was said, I send my messenger before you to prepare your way before you. So John did what he was supposed to do. He was preparing the way. But preparations are great as long as they last, but afterwards, what they've prepared for, which is not the same. Anyway, he says, so among those born of women, no one has risen greater than John the Baptist. So keep him in high regard. And yet, he adds another one-liner at the end. The least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Now, some scholars think that the least in the kingdom is Jesus himself that he's referring to. He's the least. He came as the least. He came as a poor, unknown infant, as we'll be celebrating soon. But anyone in the kingdom of heaven, that is to say, anyone in this new dispensation that Jesus is bringing that confounds all previous expectations, anyone in that new dispensation is greater than everything that came before. So the least of the least, and especially the least of the least, are the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, are greater. So this is, in fact, Jesus' new dispensation, and he does confound the expectations. I mean, just look at the other examples. The gospel acclamation today is the first line of Isaiah 61, which Jesus himself used, you may recall, at the very beginning of his public ministry to make clear who he was and what he represented in the synagogue at Nazareth. They handed him the scroll, and he opened it to Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he has anointed me. And then it goes on to say, much like Isaiah 35, that first reading, I will open the eyes of the blind, open up the dungeons, liberate people, and preach good news to the poor. He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, which is that line that he added on to the response to John today. To proclaim a year of favor from the Lord, it goes on to say. And that's all he quoted in the synagogue. He left out the last line of that passage from Isaiah. Deliberately. Because the last line is, to proclaim a year of favor from the Lord and a day of vengeance from our God. No, none of that. No fire and brimstone, no vengeance, no anger. No. That's not my kingdom. So he's choosing among his own scriptures to proclaim what his kingdom really is about, and not anybody else's kingdom. I mean, there are numerous examples. The other one is, for example, when James and John and the apostles were going through Samaria in his public ministry, and the Samaritans wouldn't receive him. James and John, the sons of thunder, say, "Lord, you want us to call down fire from heaven and consume them?" Yeah. Because that's what Elijah did in the scriptures. In the scriptures, when the king sent soldiers to bring Elijah back to the king, he called down fire from heaven and all the soldiers got burned up. 3 times. So, I mean, the scriptures. And Jesus says, you don't know of what spirit you are. So even the scriptures don't always have the spirit that Jesus represents. Jesus is deliberately choosing from his own scriptures to represent who God really is, what the kingdom really is, and who he really is in this world, what his kingdom represents. And it is that, as we see in his public ministry, constant healing of others, going around healing the weakness, the poverty, the desperation of people, meeting them where they are, precisely there, the hunger, the need, not faulting them for it, just relieving it and bringing that joy and peace. Very calmly and discreetly. And the way God still works in the world. There's a wonderful passage again in Isaiah, it's the first servant song, where it says, speaking of the servant, Jesus, he will not lift up his voice in the street and make his voice heard, the way so many preachers out in the streets do, making their voice heard. No, he won't do that. He says, a bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not quench. I mean, that's so eloquent and reassuring. The people in their utmost need and distress, when they're just about to fall apart, he doesn't say, we'll get out of here, you're a lost cause anyway. No, he doesn't break the bruised reed, and he doesn't quench the smoldering wick. Which means all we need to do is come before him in all honesty, in simplicity, which means in all poverty, not claiming anything, simply having faith. That's all he asked of the people he healed. Do you believe that I can do this? Just come as you are. And that way he's able to heal them. As he says to them, your faith has saved you. Not me. Your faith has saved you. Your openness to this love of God, which needn't be merited, can't be earned, is just this pure grace that I offer you. St. Paul had to learn the same lesson. This fiery personality who preached all over the known world. God had to tell him, my grace is sufficient for you. He was asking to have some thorn removed from his flesh. And then Paul realized, okay, it's when I'm weak that I'm strong. So I'll glory in my weaknesses, so that Christ's strength can dwell in me. All I have to do is bring my weakness and the power of God. If we bring our own power, well, we can't get in. But if we come in all honesty and simplicity and poverty, then the Lord can act with us. That's why it says, the first verse of the first reading, the desert shall blossom and rejoice and exult, the steppe, the dry land. It's not the fertile soil that we think we can bring to the Lord. It's the desert that blossoms. It's the dry, hopeless soil. That's what can receive God's grace, and that's what can bloom when we come as we truly are before the Lord. That's how God acts in our hearts and minds. That's what truly converts people. You don't convert people really and deeply, make them lovers of God instead of just fearers of God. But you don't do that by fear, by guilt, by shame, by anger and wrath. You don't convert people with that. Who would love a God like that? You convert them God converts. And if you ever had, I hope you've had some experience of this in your life where you just are suddenly, unpredictably overwhelmed with God's love and God's mercy and God's joy. Nothing you've done could have merited this. It's perhaps when you were at your most desperate that suddenly that wave of God's love and mercy and power came into you. That's what changes people. That's what changes our heart. That's what reforms our lives, because we have been reformed. We've been accepted and embraced in the midst of our poverty, precisely there. And then we know what God's love and God's mercy really mean. That's what changes us. And God works with that kind of delicacy and patience all through our lives. I can look at my own life and see how this was true, and how I could be blind in some way for decades in the midst of serving God. And God waits until just the right moment when we've finally been molded and lured in such a way that we can, oh wow, now I get it. Without removing his love at all, but delicately carrying me all the time, and then finally he can show another stage, another depth of his mercy and love, which you weren't ready for yet. What patience, God. Time means nothing to God. I love in the second reading where it says at least 4 times, be patient, have patience. He's talking to us, but it's really because God is so patient. So we can at least, if God is so patient with us, waiting decades, can't we at least show a little patience? First towards ourselves, which is maybe the hardest part. Realize that we're loved despite how we might feel unlovable, how we're still loved, precisely then, and especially then. And then we can show that same patience and magnanimity and compassion to others because we've received it ourselves. We don't have to defend ourselves and feel insecure. We can extend that same benevolence to others because we first received it. So that's what can really change our lives and change the world. When we know what it's like to receive God's love. When you know what God's love is really like. And then able to spread it out to others. So if God's kingdom, I hope it's not too much of a surprise, but if it was a surprise to John the Baptist, maybe it's a surprise to some of you. Maybe you're even hearing it for the first time, what God's kingdom is really like. But that is what God's kingdom is really like. Infinite love and compassion, which knows nothing else, no wrath, nothing. It's all just a torrent of love. And someday, if we're poor enough and honest enough and simple enough and needy enough, we'll experience it. And we'll know it's the truth. And we'll love to share it with others.